Yes, hello once again, welcome back to Classic Dirt Bike TV, where we continue our coverage of the 2023 Telford Classic Dirt Bike Show. Now we have at least another 2 videos still to feature here on my channel from the show, so still lots of very nice machines to take a look at before we are finished. So we're going to press on right now and dive straight into our next episode from the show, which of course is episode 6. Okay, so as we continue our coverage of the 2023 Telford Classic Dirt Bike Show, in this part 6 episode, we're going to start by taking a look at Peter Remington's 1963 DOT CZ. Again, a very unusual combination, seeing a twin-port CZ motor in a DOT chassis, as most of these old 1960s DOTs were almost always fitted with a Villiers 2-stroke engine of some description. But again, there wasn't an awful lot of background about this bike other than it was sitting here on the Westmoreland Motor Club stand, and the bike, as I said, belonged to Peter Remington, but the little bit of information that was posted alongside the bike said that it's a 1963 DOT, and this bike was built for Peter Remington in 1993. Although it's also said that back in 1963, DOT actually built 3 of these CZ powered bikes for their factory riders, and what eventually became of those 3 works bikes nobody knows, but there's a chance that this featured example here could be the only survivor of the 4 bikes that were built with these Czechoslovakian twin-port motors. But as I said, unusual to see a DOT off-road motorcycle fitted with one of these CZ twin-port 2-stroke engines rather than the normal Villiers motors. But having said that, this Czechoslovakian twin-porter will still be a decent replacement to the old Villiers lumps, because even for the early 1960s, these engines did have quite a good reputation for their power and engineering, and some of the world's top riders used these motors to great success during those golden days of the 1960s and early 70s. But of course, these engines were still a single cylinder, but they had a twin exhaust port in the barrel that had these twin front header pipes with an exhaust expansion chamber that ran down either side of the bike. But you can imagine that this pair of low slung exhausts would have had quite a hard life tucked underneath the motor and the chassis, and being pounded by all of that track debris. But then again, these underslung expansion chambers were a pretty standard design on many other off-road bikes from that era. And in my opinion, these CZ twin porters were a much better engine than the British made Villiers. But as you can see, our 1963 250 motor is still fitted with its factory Jikov carburetor, which were a bit prone to leaking and flooding, but when they were operating correctly, these carburetors still did a decent job of pumping the gas into this CZ engine. And on the front end of our machine, these DOTs had this leading link type of front suspension with a quite long damper there on either side, which on the face of it did look a bit antiquated and certainly unique, although as far as I know, this leading link type of setup at the front of these DOT scramblers actually worked quite well when they were on the track. Okay, so it's maybe nothing like the modern types of suspension setups we have in this modern day, but for the 1960s, this was still considered outer limits high tech. And just a simple and quite small old school drum brake here at the front, which to be fair didn't have to be much bigger because these little dot bikes weren't exactly heavy, which was one of their big pluses on these machines, because the chassis was very light and the bike certainly didn't take much to stop it or slow it down. So these smaller drum brakes were certainly more than adequate for their purpose. But the front end of these British-made dots were instantly recognisable if you ever saw one on a racetrack, because of this weird but yet efficient front end layout. And again, for the 1960s, it was just a simple pair of dampers at the rear end on our machine. Not much in the way of adjustment for these dampers, although you could still tighten or slacken the tension of those rear springs to make the bike softer or stiffer here at the back. And once more, we have the traditional polished alloy dot fuel tank on our 1963 CZ, with the dot badge there on the side with that distinctive logo devoid of trouble inscribed underneath. But still quite a substantial size of a fuel tank for a smaller two-stroke bike, and the tank also has one of those Monza style locking fuel caps on the top. And also we have an almost trials type seat on our dot scrambler. Not of course long enough to be able to move your weight around on the bike, but certainly enough padding there to be quite comfortable. And up in the controls department, our little dot still appears to have all of its original controls from 1963, with that gasser throttle and those original handlebars with the welded cross bracing bar on the top. But again, another British classic, although this time not, of course, with a Villiers motor, but a Czechoslovakian CZ twin-port engine. So that's a quick look at Peter Remington's old classic machine. Now, also sitting on the Westmoreland Motor Club stand was this 1974 Cheney Aberg 500 that belonged to Peter Hollinshead. Now, I was told on the day that this bike is currently in the process of being restored, although at exactly what stage the bike's restoration is currently at, I'm not exactly sure. But the information that I was given on the day stated that this was a Mark 6 machine, and the Cheney frame was stamped as number 4 off the Cheney production line. So now you know all of the information that I was given on the day, but you can see that the bike is powered by that big BSA B50 4-stroke motor, which is more or less the same power plant that Alan Clues used on his big CCMs of that same era. Now, with regards the specs and the details of this big BSA motor, I was never actually supplied with any information on its internals, although I suspect that it'll more than likely not be a stock B50 power plant, and that it'll probably have had some kind of exotic parts or tuning done on it before it was slipped into this Eric Cheney frame. But exactly what the Aberg connection is to this bike, I don't know, but obviously it has something to do with Swedish two-time world motocross champion Bengt Aberg, who of course won the 500 World Championship in 1969 and 1970. But my guess would be that this is some kind of replica bike of one of the machines that Bengt Aberg rode during his career, or who knows, it may even be one of the works machines that he actually did ride back in the day. But as I said, I was never given any further information on this bike on the day, so I'm just guessing and speculating on these details. And of course, the bike's chassis in this fuel tank are both made by the famous Eric Cheney, who was another one of Britain's old school motorcycle engineers, who it's said used to draw his frame designs in chalk on the wall of his workshop, and if it didn't look right, then he'd just rub it out and try again. But he said he always knew when one of his frame designs were just right before he committed them to metal. But this combination of the big BSA motor, the chrome Cheney chassis, and the blue and yellow livery just seem to all go perfect together. But once again, all of the parts, including these handlebars and grips and levers, are all the same items that would have been fitted to our Cheney BSA back in 1974. And as an old school scrambler, this Cheney certainly ticks all of the boxes when it comes to still having its factory fitted components still intact. But certainly another beautiful machine from the Peter Hollinshead motorcycle collection, because we have in the past already featured other classics from Peter's museum, and you may remember his immaculate Leto and Monarch that we featured just recently. And so this Cheney built Aberg 500 is yet another classic from Peter's vast compendium of old school motorcycle scramblers. And let's face it, who wouldn't want this little beauty sitting in their workshop? But up at the front of our Cheney, I'm pretty sure that this is a pair of Italian Seriani forks and yokes that are bolted onto our bike. But again, that's only an educated guess on my part, but they sure look like Serianis, which, to be fair, were very common on these old scramblers in the 1970s. But the front and possibly even the rear hub are certainly Rickman items, which are extremely rare to see on an older bike nowadays, but still it looks superb along with those old school steel chromed wheels, which once again are period correct for the mid 1970s. Although over the 2 days of the Telford show, this bike here was just one of hundreds of machines that were on display around the various halls, and actually a lot of the really very nice and rare bikes were so tightly packed together that you just couldn't get near them to film them or even get a good look at them. And so bikes like this Peter Hollinshead Cheney were one of the more lucky examples that we managed to film so we could share with my YouTube subscribers. Now, also on my travels around the show, I came across this nice WR 500 Yamaha. Now, I wasn't sure if this bike was being offered for sale or maybe it had already been sold, but it was sitting nice and proud here and attracting quite a bit of attention from the punters as they walk by. So what we're looking at here is a 1992 WR 500 Yamaha, which basically it was Yamaha's new bike for that year, which was a bit of a mishmash of YZ250 and YZ490 components. Now, the WR reference was an abbreviation for wide ratio, which everybody assumed that this YZ motor had a wide ratio gearbox, which of course the motor didn't have, and it was the very same transmission that was fitted onto the 1988 490, but this time the motor had a 15-tooth front and a 50-tooth rear sprocket instead of the old YZ's 1449 setup. And again, I'm not entirely sure if this example here has been through some kind of restoration recently, because it does look like it's had brand new plastics fitted recently, but for their day these were still decent bikes that had Yamaha's old Air Hammer YZ 490 motor. But essentially this so-called brand new Yamaha for 1992 was just Yamaha building a brand new model from the stocks of old YZ parts. So they then used a YZ 250 chassis and then bolted in the YZ 490 two-stroke engine, which they then gave a coat of silver paint to and then called it the WR 500. But again, very few WRs were actually made, and you almost never ever see one of these bikes at a racetrack these days. But that's the beauty of the Telford show. You can catch a glimpse of the very rare and the exotic. Now, talking of rare and exotic motorcycles, this was another nice classic, and this is a 1966 Mark I 250 Model 11 Bultaco. Not, of course, a Rickman Bultaco, although they do look quite similar in their appearance, but these Spanish-made Model 11s do have a few subtle differences to the British-made Rickman chassis. And so, firstly, the frame on this bike is made of mild steel and painted, whereas, of course, the Rickman chassis were made from Reynolds 531 steel and were nickel plated. Now, this yellow colour scheme is significantly lighter than the Rickman bikes, and our 66 Bultaco also has a fiberglass rear end, which again is slightly different in its shape to the Rickmans. But moving on to the motor, which is, as I said, a 250 two-stroke that has a 4-speed gearbox and a British-made Amel monoblock carburetor there to feed it with all of its fuel. Now, it's said that Bultaco made two different variations of this engine. One of those had a radial fin cylinder head, and the other with just a straight fin cylinder head, which we see here, which was designated the Scrambles version. And again, as you can see, this motor was fitted with this high level over the top of the engine expansion chamber, much like many of the Trials Bultacos of their day. But this was certainly a well designed and compact little Scrambles engine. But again, because this was the mid-1960s, these Bultaco Model 11s were fitted with a set of Italian Seriani front suspension units, because, as I said on our previous bikes, these Serianis were widely used on many of these old school scramblers in the 1960s, because for their day these forks were easily available and they performed reasonably well. And as we move to the rear end of our 1966 250 Bultaco, I'm pretty sure that these are not the original shocks that would have come with the bike from the Bultaco factory, as these, like the rest of the bike, look like they've undergone a restoration at some point, and these suspension units appear to have been replaced as some kind of upgrade to those much older Bultaco originals. Now, one of the other subtle differences between our Bultaco and its Rickman equivalent is the fuel tap on this tank is actually fixed at the rear of the tank and not at the front as per the Rickmans. But the more you look closely at this bike, the more you understand how unsimilar it is to those Don and Derek Rickman machines. Although at first glance you certainly could pass this bike off as one of those legendary Rickman kit bikes, because parts like the seat do look very similar to the Rickman models. Although there's certainly no doubting the engineering on this little Bultaco, it looks like it's been very well put together after its recent restoration. And as I remember, these Bultaco brake hubs had some kind of chrome liners inside, which did have a tendency to affect the braking force on this wheel, especially if it got wet. But I have to say that this little bike's been restored to a very high standard, and it still appears to have all of its stock bits and pieces from 1966, and I suspect that our 250 here will maybe not be used on the track again, but will probably remain as a show bike due to all of the hard work and the time that this owner's lavished on its restoration. But as I said before, I've certainly no problem with bikes such as these being used as showpieces rather than race bikes, because I think it's much more important that the bikes are seen and not hidden away under lock and key in a private collection somewhere underneath a cover. And it's just great that we can relive those vintage days of the 1960s and 70s through beautiful classics such as these. Well, there you have it. I do hope you enjoyed that latest selection of vintage classics from this year's 2023 Telford Classic Dirt Bike Show. As I said, we have at least 2 videos still to come from this year's show, so still plenty bikes to take a look at. So I do hope you will continue to view my channel, and more importantly, subscribe if you like what you see. But until the next time, everybody out there, continue to be safe and well when you're riding those old dirt bikes, and I hope to see you back here again very soon for part 7 from this year's 2023 Telford Classic Dirt Bike Show.